Hi folks. Tonight, we journey deep into the wild heart of the American frontier, where the mountains rise like silent giants and the winds whistle through the trees. The air is so cold, it bites your lungs and turns every breath into tiny clouds. Beneath a thick blanket of snow, the land holds its breath, still, silent, and unforgiving. And yet, in this brutal wilderness, men once dared to carve out homes. Simple cabins. Sturdy shelters. Testaments to human resilience. But make no mistake, survival here was no easy feat. If you were dropped into this world, you probably wouldn't last a week. The men who came here weren't farmers or soldiers. They were mountain men, hunters, trappers, explorers. They weren't chasing cities or gold mines. They sought furs, freedom, and the wild beauty of a land untouched. But winters were merciless. They didn't just test your strength, they crushed it. So how did these rugged men, armed with little more than axes, saws, and sheer determination, managed to survive in cabins they built with their own hands? It all started with location. A good spot meant life. Too low, and spring floods would destroy you. Too exposed, and the winter winds would rip you apart. These men looked for flat ground near water, protected by trees, hidden from rivals or raiders. Only then could they begin. Next came timber. Tall pines, oaks, cedars, cut with axes and muscle. Imagine the rhythm, the heavy swing of steel, the thud of blade against bark, the crash of a falling tree echoing through the valley. Every log was a victory, but also a reminder, winter was coming fast. Once the trees were down, the real craft began. Logs weren't just stacked like blocks. They were notched. Carefully cut so each one interlocked with the next, locking into place like a puzzle. The tighter the fit, the warmer the cabin. A single mistake could mean gaps, and gaps meant icy winds slicing through the night. But even a perfect wall wasn't enough. The spaces between logs had to be sealed. Clay, moss, straw, even animal hair, anything that could be stuffed between the cracks became insulation. Packed tight with cold, damp hands, these rough seams kept the freezing air out, and the fragile warmth in. Inside, life was as simple as it was harsh. A small hearth or fireplace was the heart of the cabin. Stone and clay formed chimneys that carried smoke away while trapping heat. Without fire, you froze. With firewood, you survived. Cutting and splitting logs became a daily ritual, as constant as breathing. Each piece of firewood was more than fuel. It was survival itself. Nights were long. The storm would rage outside, snow piling against the walls, wind screaming like wolves through the pines. But inside, the fire crackled, shadows danced, and for a few hours, a man could believe he was safe. Yet survival didn't stop with shelter and fire. Food was the other battle. Winter meant empty forests and frozen rivers. Hunting and trapping were lifelines. The snap of a trap, the rustle of deer in the distance, the faint crunch of snow under boots, these were the sounds of survival. Every successful hunt wasn't just a meal. It was hope. And danger was always near. Wolves, bears, mountain lions, the wilderness was never truly silent. Even inside the cabin, the wild pressed close, reminding you that you were never fully in control. But despite the endless hardship, the mountain men endured. They built not just cabins, but fortresses. Against hunger, against storms, against loneliness itself. Every log they cut, every stone they placed, every fire they kept alive was a small victory in a land that gave nothing for free. So tonight, as you sit warm and comfortable, imagine yourself in their place. The fire burns low. The wind howls outside. Snow presses heavy on the roof. And yet, within those 4 log walls, you are alive. For now. The mountain men knew the truth better than anyone: survival wasn't just about shelter. It was about grit, endurance, and the will to keep going, no matter how deadly the winter became. The wilderness was not kind. Out here, every mistake had consequences. Every wrong choice was a lesson carved in frostbite or hunger. And yet, the mountain men pressed on. Once a cabin stood against the snow, life inside became its own test. Imagine waking each morning to find your beard frozen stiff, the air so cold it burned your lungs. The fire from last night barely clings to life, a few glowing embers hiding beneath the ash. You drag yourself up, feed the fire with wood, and pray it catches. Because if it doesn't, the cold will not forgive you. The cabin may have been strong, but it was not luxurious. No glass windows, no iron stoves, no comforts. Light came through small openings, often covered with greased paper or animal hide to block the wind. Beds were rough frames stuffed with straw or pine boughs. Blankets, if you were lucky, were stitched from animal hides. The smell inside was a mix of smoke, damp earth, and the sharp musk of fur drying by the fire. The work never ended. Firewood had to be replenished constantly. Traps had to be checked. Meat had to be smoked or salted to last the season. Even snow was gathered and melted for water. In the wilderness, survival was motion. To stop was to die. But there were moments of silence too, strange, haunting silences. Step outside the cabin at night, and the world felt endless. The moonlight glittered on snow so bright it stung your eyes. The trees creaked in the wind, like ancient voices whispering through the dark. And far off, a wolf howled, lonely, hungry, alive. Inside, the men told stories. Some were about the hunts, others about home, faraway towns, families they had left behind, or futures they might never see. The crackling of the fire was the rhythm to their words, each flame a reminder of how thin the line between survival and oblivion really was. Winter months dragged on endlessly. Food supplies shrank. Men grew leaner, their faces hollowed by cold and hunger. But still, the cabins stood. Each one a stubborn monument to grit. And when spring finally arrived, when the snow began to melt and the rivers roared back to life, those cabins remained. Rough, weather-beaten, scarred by storms, but still standing. Proof that man could claim a place, however small, against the might of the mountains. These cabins were more than wood and stone. They were lifeboats in an ocean of snow. They were hope, carved by axe and handsaw, built on blood and determination. So the next time you see a log cabin, whether in a museum, on a trail, or deep in the woods, remember what it meant. Not comfort. Not style. But survival. A simple home that held back death one frozen night at a time. The mountain men may be gone now, their era swallowed by history. But their cabins remain as whispers of a time when survival depended on courage, and when every fire lit in the darkness was a victory against the wilderness. The wilderness tested every man who dared to enter it. To survive meant more than strength, it meant skill, patience, and sometimes sheer stubbornness. And nowhere was this more true than in the brutal winters of the high mountains. When the first snows fell, a mountain man's cabin was his fortress. But even a fortress was only as strong as the men who lived inside it. Food was life. Without it, a cabin was just a wooden coffin. Mountain men learned quickly that winter hunting was not the same as summer hunting. Animals grew scarce, migrating down to lower elevations. The ones that remained, elk, deer, or the occasional moose, were leaner, harder to track, and more dangerous when cornered. Every bullet, every arrow had to count. Ammunition was precious. A wasted shot could mean days without meat. Successful hunts were followed by long hours of work, skinning, butchering, and preserving the meat. Some was smoked above the cabin fire, filling the rafters with a greasy haze. Some was buried deep under snow to keep it frozen. But hunger had no patience. There were days when the traps came up empty, when the howls of wolves echoed outside while the men inside gnawed on scraps of jerky, each bite tougher than the last. Inside, space was tight. A single-room cabin had to serve as kitchen, workshop, bedroom, and storeroom. Tools hung on the walls. Animal pelts were stacked in corners, drying, stiffening. Above the fire, strips of meat dangled, dripping fat onto the flames. The fire never truly went out, it couldn't. To let it die meant facing the cruel reality of starting a flame in sub-zero temperatures with numb fingers and damp wood. Many cabins kept embers alive for months, fed carefully day and night. But the smoke that saved them also choked them. With no chimneys, only small holes in the roof, the cabin often filled with a thick, eye-burning haze. Men coughed through the nights, their lungs blackened by wood smoke, but they preferred smoke over death by freezing. Winter in the mountains was not just a test of the body, it was a war on the mind. Days blended together. The silence outside grew heavy, broken only by the creak of trees or the distant crack of shifting ice. Some men talked to themselves. Others carved figures out of wood, just to keep their hands busy. A few wrote journals, leaving behind the only records of their lonely existence. But some went mad. Stories were whispered of men who abandoned their cabins in blizzards, wandering into the white void and never returning. Not every man in the wilderness was alone. Sometimes, a knock at the door in the middle of the night meant another trapper seeking shelter. Other times, it meant trouble. Rivalries ran deep in the fur trade, and cabins could become battlegrounds for territory. But not all visitors were enemies. Native tribes often crossed paths with mountain men. Some brought trade, dried meat, hides, tools. Others brought warnings, avalanches, hostile hunting grounds, or news of rival trappers. Respect was earned slowly, sometimes painfully, but for many mountain men, survival was only possible with the knowledge shared by the people who had lived in the mountains long before them. The cabin as legacy. Through it all, the cabin remained the center of survival. Each log bore the marks of an axe swung in desperation. Each stone in the hearth told of nights when fire meant life. When spring finally came, many cabins were abandoned as trappers followed the rivers to trade posts. But some cabins remained, silent, weathered, and empty. Travelers who stumbled upon them years later often found rusted traps, old pelts, or even forgotten journals tucked into cracks in the walls. These cabins were not homes in the way we think of homes today. They were lifelines. Proof that, in the deadliest winters, men could carve survival out of the wilderness with nothing more than their hands, their grit, and their will to live. And though the age of the mountain men has passed, their cabins still stand in valleys and forests, reminders of a time when survival was a daily gamble, and when every log, every ember, and every night survived was a victory against nature itself. The wilderness was not just a backdrop, it was the enemy, the teacher, and the final judge. For the mountain men of the 1800s, the high Rockies and the American frontier were a place of wealth and death, freedom and silence. And when the deadly winters came, survival boiled down to one thing: the cabin. The origins of the mountain men. These men were not born in the wilderness. Many came from farms, towns, and cities in the east. They followed the call of the fur trade, drawn by promises of fortune in beaver pelts, soft gold that fetched high prices in Europe. But once they left behind the comfort of civilization, they entered a world where only skill and grit mattered. The moment they picked up the axe to cut down the first tree, they began writing their survival story. The building of a cabin. Building a cabin was not art, it was war. Each tree felled by hand with an axe. Each log dragged, lifted, and fitted into place. Moss, mud, or clay was shoved between cracks to seal out the freezing wind. Roofs were layered with bark, branches, or sod, heavy enough to withstand snow but light enough not to crush the frame. A good cabin could take weeks. A desperate one could be thrown together in days. But every cabin meant the difference between dying in a snowstorm and living to see spring. Daily routines in the wilderness. Once inside, life followed strict rhythms. Morning, stoke the fire, melt snow for water, check traps. Afternoon, cut more wood, hunt, repair gear, smoke meat. Evening, cook whatever was caught, mend clothing, share stories. Night, guard the fire, listen for wolves, and try to sleep through the howling wind. Every hour was survival work. A single day of laziness could mean weeks of suffering. The cabin walls gave protection, but outside lurked constant danger. Avalanches could sweep entire slopes clean. Blizzards could trap a man inside for weeks, sealing doors with snow. Wild animals, bears searching for food, wolves desperate for meat, could circle a cabin, their glowing eyes visible in the firelight through cracks in the wall. And yet, the greatest enemy was not the beasts or storms. It was hunger. Without steady supplies, even the strongest mountain man grew weak, his cabin turning from shelter into prison. Encounters and rivalries. The wilderness was not empty. Mountain men crossed paths with native tribes, sometimes trading for food, hides, or wisdom. In many cases, survival depended on their knowledge of the land. But other encounters brought conflict, over territory, hunting grounds, or mistrust. Rival mountain men could be just as dangerous. A trapper's pelts were worth a fortune, and stories spread of cabins raided, traps stolen, or lone men vanishing into the snow after mysterious gunshots in the night. Legends of the wilderness. History remembers names like Jim Bridger, Jedediah Smith, and Hugh Glass, men who braved the wilds and became legends. Smith mapped vast territories but was mauled by a grizzly and left for dead, only to stagger back to life. Hugh Glass, torn apart by a bear in 1823, crawled for 6 weeks through hostile land with broken bones just to reach safety. Their cabins, if they had them, were more than structures. They were symbols of defiance, proof that man could stare down death and refuse to bow. Psychological battles. Isolation took its toll. A cabin might protect from the cold, but it could not shield from loneliness. Some men wrote journals, their handwriting shaky by firelight, recording every snowfall, every missed shot, every dream of home. Others cracked under the silence. Voices in the wind, shadows in the snow, hallucinations of warm fires and full tables haunted them. Today, some of these cabins still remain. Weathered logs, sagging roofs, empty hearths. Tourists and hikers see them as relics of a romantic past. But to the mountain men, they were never romantic. They were survival, plain and brutal. Each cabin was a battlefield one. A place where frostbite was kept at bay, where hunger was fought off one rabbit at a time, and where life held on by the flicker of a fire. The mountain men may be gone, their era buried under centuries of change. But the cabins remain, whispers in the wilderness, proof that against snow, silence, and death itself, human will once carve out a fragile victory. For the mountain men, cabins were not just shelters, they were also storehouses of fortune. Every pelt, every fur stretched across wooden frames inside the smoky cabin walls carried a value far beyond the wilderness. Beaver pelts, soft and waterproof, were the most prized. Packed tightly in bundles, they could be traded at rendezvous camps for rifles, powder, knives, cloth, and even a rare taste of whiskey. But winters threatened that wealth. Damp air could rot furs. Rodents could gnaw holes through them. Rival trappers might burn down a cabin just to destroy a competitor's hull. A year's worth of work could vanish in a single night. So cabins became vaults, each log sealing not only survival but also dreams of riches. Yet many mountain men died poor. Fortune in the wilderness was fleeting, carried away with the spring thaw. Not every cabin held a survivor. Some became tombs. The snow would pile high against the walls, sealing the door shut. Inside, the firewood dwindled, food ran out, and silence fell. Travelers stumbling upon abandoned cabins often found chilling signs: a half-burned log in the hearth, a rusted rifle leaning in the corner, animal bones scattered on the floor, and sometimes, nothing at all. The mountains had a way of swallowing men whole, leaving behind only whispers. More than wood or stone, fire was the true lifeline. A mountain man guarded his fire like treasure. Sparks were struck with flint and steel, coaxed into flame with dry grass or birch bark. Inside the cabin, the fire glowed day and night, filling the small space with heat, smoke, and shadows. Meat was hung above it, hide stretched near it, and weary men slept as close as they dared to its warmth. But fire was also danger. A stray spark could set the cabin ablaze, turning months of labor into ashes. Men learned to respect fire as both savior and destroyer. Though many mountain men lived alone, there were times when companionship was the only shield against despair. 2 or 3 trappers might share a cabin, splitting chores, hunting together, and keeping watch through endless nights. They argued, they fought, but they also shared laughter, crude jokes, tall tales, and songs from home. In the wilderness, even a single human voice could push back the crushing silence. And yet, brotherhood was fragile. Hunger bred tension. Disputes over traps, pelts, or territory could erupt into violence. More than one cabin saw blood spilled on its dirt floor. By the mid-1800s, the age of the mountain men began to fade. Fashion in Europe shifted, demand for beaver pelts declined, and settlements pushed deeper into the frontier. Cabins once built for survival were abandoned to rot, their roofs collapsing, their logs sinking into the earth. The men who had braved the winters either disappeared into history or became guides for westward settlers, carrying their knowledge of survival into a new age. But the cabins they left behind never truly vanished. Some still stand today, weather-beaten monuments to a time when the wilderness ruled, and when a single man and his axe could carve life out of the frozen silence. The cabin itself was only possible because of tools, simple, heavy, and unforgiving. An axe wasn't just for wood. It was a weapon, a hammer, a shovel, and sometimes even a makeshift anvil. Knives were sharpened daily, their blades kept keen enough to skin a beaver or gut a deer in minutes. Flint and steel were carried in pouches, guarded like gold, for without fire a cabin was nothing more than a frozen trap. Every tool had a story. Many were broken, reforged, or traded a dozen times before being lost to rust in the soil of the frontier. But in the hands of a mountain man, a single axe could mean the difference between life and death. Hunting filled the pot, but it was never enough. Men learned to scrape sustenance from the land itself. Pine needles were brewed into bitter tea to ward off scurvy. Roots and bark were boiled into thin stews, earthy and hard to swallow, but life-saving. Sometimes, in the bleakest weeks, even leather was boiled, belts, moccasins, scraps of hide, softened and chewed for any hint of nourishment. It was survival stripped down to its rawest form, proof that a cabin's walls could keep out the wind, but they could never fill an empty stomach. Not all nights passed quietly. Imagine the sound, a low growl outside the log walls, followed by the crunch of snow under heavy paws. Bears, roused from shallow hibernation, could tear through cabins in search of food. Wolves circled, their glowing eyes catching the flicker of fire through cracks in the logs. And then there were men. A knock on the door in the dead of night might be a fellow trapper seeking warmth, or a rival ready to take what you had. In the wilderness, trust was scarce, and every visitor was a gamble between friendship and betrayal. When spring came, they emerged from the snow-choked valleys and gathered at the great rendezvous. Here, the pelts carried through winter were piled high, traded for powder, lead, whiskey, cloth, and the rare comfort of company. Songs echoed across camps, deals were struck, and rivalries flared. For a short season, the wilderness felt alive with voices again. And then, just as quickly, silence returned. The men broke camp, shouldered their gear, and vanished back into the forests, leaving their cabins to wait for another deadly winter. Some cabins became famous. Stories tell of Jim Bridger carving maps into wooden walls by firelight, of Hugh Glass dragging his broken body into a half-built shelter after the bear attack that nearly killed him, of nameless men who froze just steps from the safety of their doors. Every cabin still standing today holds secrets in its timbers, claw marks, bullet holes, initials carved deep into logs. Each one whispers a tale of struggle, a reminder that survival was never guaranteed, only fought for. Today, we see cabins as quaint, rustic symbols of frontier life. But to the mountain men, they were not romantic. They were shields, built in desperation, designed for nothing but survival. Their lesson is simple but timeless: comfort is fragile, but resilience is everything. In the heart of the mountains, stripped of luxury, stripped of society, all that remained was fire, grit, and the will to endure. And though the mountain men themselves are long gone, their cabins remain as echoes in the wilderness, weathered, cracked, but still standing, just as they once stood against the rage of deadly winters. The fire burned low, glowing red in the hearth, its light flickering across rough-hewn log walls. Shadows danced like restless spirits. Inside, a mountain man sat hunched over, his beard frosted with ice that hadn't yet melted. He cradled a tin cup, steam rising from the bitter pine needle tea within. "Another storm's coming," one man muttered, his voice gravelly from cold and smoke. "Aye," another replied, pulling a blanket tighter around his shoulders. "If the roof holds, we'll make it. If not," his voice trailed off into silence. The cabin groaned as the wind pressed against it, snow rattling against the shutters. In moments like this, the men knew how fragile their shelter truly was. A single weak beam, a miscut notch, and the wilderness would reclaim its ground. Imagine it, months without another human voice. The mountain swallowing sound, the snow muffling every step. Cabin fever wasn't just a phrase, it was a slow descent into loneliness. Some men carved marks into logs to count the days. Others kept journals by firelight, scratching words onto scraps of paper with trembling hands. And many, simply stopped counting. The silence could be suffocating. A creak in the night might be a log shifting, or something else. The mind, starved of voices, began to fill the void with whispers of its own. After endless weeks of biting cold, when the snow finally began to soften and drip from the eaves, it was as if the world exhaled. The ice cracked and rivers swelled with roaring water. Birds returned, their songs piercing the long silence of winter. The mountain men would step outside their cabins, blinking into the pale sun, faces gaunt but eyes alive. They had survived. And survival meant another chance to trap, to hunt, to live. But every man knew, winter would come again. The cabin wasn't a permanent victory. It was only borrowed time. Not every cabin was filled with warmth and survival. Some were abandoned, left to rot into the earth. Travelers stumbled upon them years later, doors hanging open, fireplaces cold, tools rusting in corners. What had happened to the men who built them? Were they taken by wolves, sickness, hunger, or did they simply walk away, leaving their shelter to the trees? These ghost cabins became markers in the wilderness, warnings carved into the land itself. Proof that the mountains demanded respect, and that no man, no matter how strong, could ever truly tame them. Today, a handful of these frontier cabins still stand. Their logs darkened with centuries of wind and rain, their roofs sagging but unbroken. Tourists walk through them with cameras, marveling at their simplicity. But to understand them, you must strip away the modern eye. Forget the romance. Forget the quaint. What you see is desperation solidified in wood. Each notch, each stone, each layer of chinking was a cry against the cold. And yet, they still stand. Proof of human endurance. Proof that even against the deadliest winters, the will to survive carves its mark into history. The fire crackled, throwing sparks into the smoky air. The cabin walls creaked under the weight of heavy snow pressing from outside. Inside, two mountain men sat hunched near the hearth, their faces glowing red from the flames, their shadows stretched long and thin across the logs. Wood's running low, muttered Caleb, tossing another log onto the fire. We burn it too fast, and come February, we'll be done for. Ezra, older, with a beard white as the frost clinging to the windows, shook his head slowly. You worry too much, boy. I been through winters twice as cruel. Trick is, cut before you're cold. Never after. A man who waits for the chill to drive him out, well, he won't last long. A silence fell between them, broken only by the whistle of wind squeezing through a crack in the roof. Ezra chuckled low, a sound like gravel grinding underfoot. The mountains don't care, son. They don't want, they don't hate. They just are. And it's us who've got to bend or break. The fire popped, and for a moment, the young man stared into it, his eyes wide, as if the flames themselves were whispering some secret truth. For every cabin filled with laughter and stories, there were others, where silence reigned. Imagine walking into one such shelter. The table still set with wooden bowls. A fur cloak draped over a chair. But the fire, long dead, only ashes cold and gray. No footprints in the snow outside, no sign of struggle, just absence. The cabin had become a tomb, the wilderness reclaiming what men had tried to take. These places became legends whispered around other fires, stories of hunters who vanished, never to be seen again. And so, every knock of an axe against wood, every strike of flint against steel, carried with it not just the promise of survival, but the shadow of failure. Back inside the living cabin, Ezra leaned forward, his face lit by firelight. Let me tell you something, boy, he said, voice firm. A cabin ain't just logs and mud. It's a promise. You build it wrong, you'll freeze. You build it strong, you'll live. But the cabin don't care about you. It don't owe you a damn thing. You give it life, or you die inside it. Caleb swallowed hard, staring at the door where snow piled high against the frame. And what if I can't make it strong enough? Ezra's eyes narrowed, the lines in his weathered face deepening. Then you learn. Or you don't come back next winter. The wind screamed outside, but inside, the cabin stood steady. Each cabin that still stands today, scattered across valleys, hidden in forests, perched on mountain slopes, carries within its walls the echoes of these men. The arguments, the laughter, the silence, the fear. As the flames flickered, their shadows stretched across the cabin walls, larger than life, monstrous, almost inhuman. Caleb stared at them, shivering. Sometimes. I think the fire's showing us something. Like the mountains are watching. Ezra stirred the embers with an iron poker. Not watching. Waiting. These peaks been here long before us. They'll be here long after. Silas smirked, though his eyes betrayed unease. Maybe the mountains do more than wait. Maybe they keep count. The wind howled through the cracks, and the cabin groaned as though the wilderness pressed against every side. For a moment, even the fire seemed smaller, weaker, as if it too feared the night. Yet, in that fragile wooden box of logs and clay, a bond grew between the men. Each story shared, each log thrown on the fire, each fear confessed, it stitched them tighter together. Survival wasn't just about cabins or axes or traps. It was about trust. Knowing the man beside you wouldn't falter when the snow was deepest, when the hunger bit hardest, when the wolves came closest. For in the wilderness, a man alone was a dead man. But 3 men with 1 fire could endure almost anything. The storm had raged for 3 nights without pause. Snow piled high against the cabin walls, blocking the windows, sealing the men in darkness. The fire had burned low, the last log spitting sparks before sinking into glowing embers. Caleb shivered, pulling the fur blanket tighter. "That's it," he whispered. That was the last of it. Ezra stared at the dying fire, jaw tight. "Not yet. Cabin's still wood, ain't it? You want to live, you feed it piece by piece." Silas slammed his hand against the table. "You're saying tear apart the very thing keeping us alive." Ezra's voice was hard as stone. "Better to burn a wall than freeze to death staring at it." The men looked around the cabin, at the beams, the supports, the very skeleton of their survival. Every log had been cut with sweat and blood. The storm had broken, but the silence it left behind was heavier than the snow on the roof. The fire burned weakly, the smell of charred wood and smoke clinging to every surface. Caleb stirred awake, his body aching from the cold. He turned, but Ezra's blanket was still, untouched by breath. Silas, too, lay motionless, his hand stiff around the hilt of his knife as if he had been guarding the fire even in death. Caleb sat frozen, staring at the 2 men who had carried him through the long nights. His breath came out in sharp clouds. Alone. He was alone now. With no shovel, no ground to break, Caleb used his raw hands to dig into the snow just beyond the cabin door. The earth was frozen solid beneath, unyielding. So he did what men had done before him, laid the bodies side by side in the snowbank, covering them with furs and broken planks. "They kept me alive," he whispered, his voice cracking. "And now the mountain keeps you." The wind carried his words away, scattering them into the endless white. Days passed. Caleb, driven not by hunger but by memory, began cutting new logs. Alone, every swing of the axe felt heavier, every drag through the snow slower. But he kept at it, his body trembling, his spirit burning. This time, he muttered through chattering teeth, "I'll build it stronger. For you. For all of us." The cabin he raised was smaller, tighter, its walls thick and low to hold in every flicker of heat. Each log carried the weight of loss, each strike of the axe a vow to survive. And when the fire was lit in that new hearth, its glow seemed to stretch toward the snowbank where Ezra and Silas rested, as if carrying warmth to them still. Years later, travelers who stumbled upon that hidden valley found a solitary cabin, weathered but unbroken, standing against the wind. Inside, they saw carvings along the beams, names etched deep into the wood: Ezra, Silas, Caleb. And though no man remained, the cabin told their story. It whispered of nights spent fighting the storm, of walls burned for warmth, of men who gave everything to defy the mountain. For in the wilderness, cabins were not just shelters. They were legacies, proof that even when men passed, their will to survive lived on in timber and ash. Centuries later, long after the last axe had fallen silent, a lone traveler picked his way through the snow-choked valley. His boots crunched against the frozen earth, his breath clouding in the brittle air. And there it was, a cabin, leaning but unbroken, its logs silvered with age, its roof sagging under the weight of time. He paused at the threshold, running a gloved hand along the grooves carved deep into the timber. Names. 3 of them. Ezra, Silas, Caleb. The letters were rough, uneven, but they carried a power stronger than ink on paper. They were scars of survival. The traveler pushed open the door. The hinges screamed, and the stale air inside smelled of dust and long-dead smoke. In the corner, the remains of a hearth stood cold, its stones blackened with soot. Against the wall, a broken chair. And on the far beam, faint etchings, not words this time, but marks like tally lines. Dozens of them, scratched deep. One for each day survived. He closed his eyes, and for a moment, he could almost hear it, the crackle of fire, the low voices of men trading stories, the storm clawing at the walls. Shadows seemed to dance across the wood, as if the cabin still remembered. The traveler sat where the fire once burned. He pulled a notebook from his pack, his pen scratching as he wrote, "These cabins are not ruins. They are monuments. They speak without tongues, they teach without books. They tell us of hunger, of fear, of brotherhood. They remind us that survival is not comfort, it is sacrifice." Outside, the wind moaned through the valley, carrying with it a voice older than memory. The traveler closed his book, bowed his head, and whispered, "They're still here. In the wood. In the silence. In the fire that once burned." When he left, the cabin stood alone again, snow gathering at its doorstep, shadows thick within. But its story had already outlived the men who built it. For every log still upright, every scar etched into the wood, was proof of something greater than survival. Proof of defiance. Proof that men could bend against the mountain and leave behind more than bones in the snow. And so long as even one cabin still stands in the wilderness, the mountain men are not gone. Their ghosts live in timber, their voices whisper in the wind, and their fire, though unseen, still burns. The camera pans across endless white peaks. Valleys buried in snow. Forests standing silent, their branches heavy with frost. And in the distance, the dark silhouette of a cabin, barely holding against the weight of centuries. A narrator's voice cuts through the silence. The mountain men were not conquerors. They were survivors. Every log they split, every fire they lit, every cabin they raised was not just a home, it was a defiance of nature itself. The sound of an axe echoes faintly. Thud. 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 They knew the wilderness would never love them. But still, they built. Still, they endured. And in doing so, they left behind something more than wood and clay. They left behind proof that human will can burn even in the coldest winters. Inside the cabin, life was measured not by hours, but by survival tasks. The sun might rise, but its pale light did little to warm the icy world outside. Inside, the men stirred the embers of the fire, coaxing them back into flames before the frost crept too deep into their bones. Breakfast was simple, often dried meat, a thin broth, or whatever the traps had yielded the night before. There were no luxuries here. Every bite carried the weight of survival, and wasting food was unthinkable. By day, the men worked endlessly. Splitting logs. Repairing the roof against heavy snowfall. Checking traps. Sharpening blades dulled by the relentless work. Even silence was heavy, punctuated only by the scraping of tools or the muffled howl of the wind through the cracks. And when night fell, they gathered close to the fire. Sometimes there were stories. Sometimes silence. Sometimes just the sound of boots drying by the hearth. This was life. Hard. Repetitive. Unforgiving. Yet, it was life. Mountain men developed their own quiet rituals, born out of necessity. Before leaving the cabin, a man would check his traps, run his hands along the stock of his rifle, and whisper a prayer, not for riches, but simply to return alive. They learned to read the skies, the color of the horizon, the weight of the air, the feel of snow before it fell. These were their calendars, their warnings, their guides. At night, they listened. Not just to the fire, but to the forest itself. The crack of a branch might mean prey. Or it might mean a predator. The wilderness was never silent. It spoke constantly. And survival meant learning its language. Though many mountain men lived alone, they often crossed paths, trappers sharing the same valleys, hunters following the same rivers. When they did, there was an unspoken understanding. Survival was easier when shared. A pot of stew passed between hands. A night spent under the same roof. A story traded in exchange for silence broken. These brief bonds mattered. In a world so empty, even a stranger's voice was worth more than gold. And yet, trust was fragile. Territory was life. Fur meant survival. A wrong word, a misplaced step, and the bond could snap into rivalry. But for those fleeting moments of brotherhood, the wilderness felt a little less endless. Eventually, winter loosened its grip. The snow softened, the rivers cracked and flowed again, the air no longer bit like a knife. For the mountain men, spring was not just a season, it was rebirth. Cabins that had grown under the weight of storms now stood proud against the thaw. Smoke rose once again from their chimneys, carrying the scent of survival into the clear skies. The men emerged leaner, harder, tempered by the cold. They had lived. Against all odds, they had lived. But survival was not victory. For every cabin that endured, another collapsed into ruin. For every man who returned to the trading posts with pelts and stories, another lay buried beneath snowdrifts, his name forgotten, his cabin reclaimed by the forest. Today, few cabins remain. Most have rotted back into the soil, their logs scattered, their chimneys crumbled. But in the wild places, deep in the Rockies, or hidden in Appalachian valleys, a few still stand. Step inside, and you'll smell the ghosts of wood smoke. Touch the walls, and you'll feel the grooves of hands that work tirelessly to fit each log. Close your eyes, and you'll hear the crackle of a fire that once kept death at bay. These cabins are more than relics. They are echoes. Reminders that survival is not easy, not clean, not romantic. It is work. It is sacrifice. It is a story of men who faced the wilderness, and refused to be broken by it. The mountain men did not conquer the wilderness. They adapted to it. They bent, but they did not break. Their cabins were more than shelter, they were symbols. Of endurance. Of defiance. Of the fire that lives in every man who dares to step into the unknown. The fire fades. The wind carries the last embers into the night sky. And with it, the story of the mountain men drifts into legend. The mountain men never wrote manuals. They didn't leave behind blueprints. Their knowledge lived in muscle memory, in the swing of an axe, in the way they shaped a notch, in the patience it took to stack logs so tightly that no breath of winter could break through. Later settlers learned from these men. Farmers, pioneers, even soldiers moving west, all borrowed their techniques. A cabin built with care could last decades, sheltering families, housing dreams, even serving as schools or trading posts. These cabins were not just structures. They were classrooms of survival, each one teaching the same lesson, that nature is not conquered, only respected. What began as solitary shelters for trappers and hunters slowly became the foundations of frontier towns. One cabin turned into two. Then a cluster. Then a village. The fire that once warmed a single man now warmed families. Children played near hearths. Women stretched furs into clothing. Men told stories of hunts and winters long past. The mountain men had not intended to build communities. But their cabins became seeds, and out of those seeds, civilization grew. Over time, the image of the mountain man transformed. They were no longer just hunters or trappers. They became folk heroes, larger than life. Legends grew around their cabins, their rifles, their ability to live where no ordinary man could. Tales of men wrestling bears, surviving avalanches, or carving entire lives out of nothing but forest and stone filled the pages of dime novels. Some of it was truth. Much of it was myth. But all of it carried the same message: the wilderness can be faced, if a man is willing to pay the price. Today, the world has changed. We heat our homes with the turn of a dial. Our walls are built by machines. Our food comes from stores, not traps in the snow. And yet, in the rise of tiny homes, in the fascination with off-grid living, in the survival shows watched by millions, the spirit of the mountain men lingers. People still dream of cabins in the woods. Of silence broken only by fire and wind. Of proving, if only for a moment, that they too could survive, if civilization were stripped away. The cabins of the mountain men still stand in forgotten valleys and deep forests, their logs scarred by centuries. They are more than ruins. They are reminders. That survival is not just about shelter, or food, or fire. It is about will. About refusing to give in, even when the world seems determined to break you. The camera lingers on a cabin half buried in snow. The fire inside long gone. But its walls still stand. The mountain men built more than homes. They built a legacy. A story carved in wood and stone, written not with ink, but with endurance. And though winters will always return, their spirit endures. Freedom always carries a cost. For the mountain men, that cost was comfort, safety, and sometimes life itself. They chose the wilderness not because it was easy, but because it was honest. Every log cabin they built was a declaration: I will not bow to winter. I will not surrender to hunger. I will carve my own place in this world. But that freedom was brutal. A single mistake could mean death. A dull axe. A roof left half done. A hunt that failed. Freedom was never free, it was earned with sweat, blood, and unshakable resolve. The mountain men were not the first to build cabins. Long before them, indigenous nations had mastered survival, creating lodges, teepees, and longhouses adapted to their landscapes. The mountain men observed, learned, borrowed, and sometimes imitated. The land itself was the greatest teacher. A rushing river taught where not to build. The lean of a tree revealed the direction of the prevailing winds. The cracks in stone told them how frost shaped the earth. The mountain men were not the first to build cabins. Long before them, indigenous nations had mastered survival, creating lodges, teepees, and longhouses adapted to their landscapes. The mountain men observed, learned, borrowed, and sometimes imitated. The land itself was the greatest teacher. A rushing river taught where not to build. The lean of a tree revealed the direction of the prevailing winds. The cracks in stone told them how frost shaped the earth. Their cabins were not just structures, they were textbooks written by nature, studied by men who listened. Every cabin had a story. The axe marks on logs told of the man who swung it. The smoke stains above a fireplace whispered of winters endured. The carvings on a door frame marked births, deaths, and loves long gone. Here it stands. Alone. Silent. Scarred by centuries. This cabin, once a lifeline for a mountain man, now a monument to endurance. It sheltered him through blizzards, through hunger, through nights when even the stars seemed frozen. Every log placed here was a battle won against the wilderness. The man is gone. His fire long extinguished. But his spirit lingers in the timber, in the silence, in the defiance carved into these walls. The mountain men did not just survive, they left behind a legacy, proof that even in the deadliest winters, the human will can build, endure, and remain. The wilderness always wins in the end, but for a moment in time, man stood unbroken.